welcome to all of our panellists and all of our people attending this Pride in Faith event. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all as we celebrate LGBT plus History Month at the University of Plymouth. So my name is Alice Ludgate. I'm Head of Student Services and also one of the two senior champions for LGBT plus in the university. So it's me and one of our executive deans takes on that role. I mentioned earlier, it would ordinarily have been my wonderful colleague, Andrew Grace, who would have been chairing and sort of opening this event. Sadly, Andy couldn't be here today, so I've been asked to stand in, which is of course a delight, but I will just express my thanks to Andy and the team for organising this event and for the continuous efforts that they all make in supporting all of our staff and students, and particularly for championing the rights and the lives of LGBT plus students and staff. So before we get going, just want to say a few words about LGBT plus History Month, because I think it provides a really important moment yet again to raise awareness of LGBT plus people and recognise the value that they bring to our communities. For too long, LGBT plus has been hidden. Although this is a history month, it isn't that far in history that we all have to look back to see just exactly how some of the how LGBT plus communities were indeed hidden. So months like this are a really good prompt to raise awareness of that, as well as celebrate the lives of LGBT plus people today. Certainly for me, I think it gives a chance to promote welfare and to increase visibility, which ultimately makes our workplaces and educational establishments and our lives a lot safer. I think it's quite interesting that the theme for LGBT plus History Month in 2021 is body, mind and spirit. So this event about pride in faith feels particularly relevant. We've got a number of speakers lined up who are going to share their experiences, challenges, complexities and the joy that faith and religion can bring when identifying as LGBT plus. As you can see, we've got a really great panel here who will come from different backgrounds and share their stories with you all. And we'll go through each person one by one. You'll all have 10 minutes to talk, and then we'll, at the end of the session, probably for the last 20 minutes or so, have a Q&A, whether that's from panelists wanting to ask questions of each other or members of the audience who want to do that. So I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and facilitate that when we get to it. So in terms of one by one, our first speaker is Pritpal Bhullar. So I will hand over to you if you're happy to unmute yourself. And if anyone looks like they're veering over the 10-minute mark, I'll give you a gentle nudge. But so don't worry if I do that. You may not be looking at the clock. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Great to be with you all today. So my name is Pritpal. I'm representing Sarbat LGBT plus 6, which is an organisation that provides support to people from the LGBT plus community that also have a Sikh faith or have an interest in the Sikh faith. So I'm just here today really to share my story with you in terms of how that intersection between my sexual orientation, which is bisexual, intersects with my faith, and the challenges that I faced in terms of trying to bring the two together. So essentially, I grew up in Buckinghamshire, and so where I grew up, it was quite a semi-rural area. Lots of people lived in villages, generally tended to be quite white and very sort of Church of England generally with the background. So with my visible faith identity, I stuck out, obviously being from a ethnic minority group as well. I stuck out even more. So, I was always seen as being different when I was growing up. So one of the focuses, certainly as a child, was around my faith and my racial identity and the differences that people could see that were there for them. So obviously there was some racism, there was some curiosity, and there was things in between as well. And quite a lot of the things I had to do to learn about my faith, about the Punjabi, the language that my forefathers spoke. I mean, I'm fourth generation of my family here, but biologically my family are all from an Indian background. but they came here while the British, we weren't really immigrants because we came here from British India, which was ruled by the British. So we came here as people moving from another part of the crown, moving to another part of the crown, really. So I don't consider myself an immigrant at all, but people see me in that way all the time as an outsider. So I've always had that to contend with, the fact that I feel very English, but have been always treated as somebody who was something other than English. So that's been an interesting sort of a different dimension to look at. I guess my first memory of when I had an attraction to somebody of the same sex was probably when I was about 7 or 8. But I didn't really think much of it because I remember watching, and it was actually Tom Cruise. I remember watching a film in which Tom Cruise was the lead actor, and I thought, God, he looks really attractive. I really fancy him. And I thought, oh, that can't be right, because I also fancied the lead that was playing opposite him. I think the film was Cocktail. I don't know how many of you remember it, but and I was like sort of a bit confused. I wasn't quite sure who I fancied, but I contended that it was obviously a phase, and it was definitely the women that I must have fancied, because that was the world we lived in. It was very heteronormative, and I must have been just having a moment of weakness of some sort. I'd never thought about it again until I was about 15, when I first got a crush on another guy that was at school with me. And again, at that stage, I just thought, because again, I was attracted to girls at the time and women, so I really didn't think of it much other than I'm growing up. I don't really know. I'm growing up. I've got all these hormones that are flowing in my body. I obviously don't know what I'm thinking about, and it's I'll get through this phase. Interesting, when I was sort of growing up, there was no role models. There was a law at the time called Section 28, which applied to all schools and educational settings, which meant that teachers were not allowed to talk about any issues around LGBT plus identities. So even if I did approach a teacher to sort of say, can you tell me about these feelings that I've got, or these thoughts I'm having, they wouldn't be legally allowed to talk to me about it anyway. So, and there was definitely no information available on LGBT people, but also there was no role models for me either. I mean, there wasn't very many LGBT role models anyway. But for somebody to be from an ethnic minority background, from a visible faith identity, so from a Sikh background, there was nothing at all. So there was no way I could sort of in my head think, I can be like somebody else because there's a role model there. Every role model I had happened to be happily married in a straight relationship in this heteronormative world. So really, I just didn't think about it very much at all, and carried on my life living obliviously, I guess, as a heterosexual up until the point that my first marriage ended. And at that time, the world was a very different place. One, I knew much more obviously about LGBT identities, but also same-sex relationships were being recognised in law. The LGBT plus equality was coming about as well. And it's hard to think that it's not very many years ago that this happened, actually. We're only looking back 10, 12 years or so. The world was a very different place. So being a single man again, it gave me the opportunity now to really reassess who I was as a person, and that's really when my sort of moment around, oh, but then what does that mean for me with my faith? Because I had never thought about this before. It had never been an issue before. So that was the first time really it crossed my mind, and I had to really think about trying to understand, can I be bisexual? Well, actually, at the time I came out as gay because I thought I had just been denying all of this. So can I be gay? And can I be a Sikh at the same time? And I didn't know. There's nothing available in terms of literature, any material. Again, I didn't know anybody who was in a similar situation. So it took me quite some time, really, and it was quite tormenting because by that time my faith was quite strong. I knew about my faith. I certainly knew that I believed in what Sikhs are about. And this felt like a real crisis to me in my identity, which I thought was actually quite a concrete identity by this stage. I had to navigate some very difficult journeys in trying to find the information which could take me to a place where I can actually bring the two identities together and be comfortable with them. I'm very fortunate actually, because Sikhism believes in equality, and we are all equal before God, regardless of our gender, our sexual orientation, our status in life, or racial identity or faith or anything. We're all seen as equal. And when this was explained to me, I thought, well, that's great. But then we don't have any role models that are openly out in the Sikh community. We don't have any LGBT inclusive places within the faith. So there was a bit of a disconnect there, because although the faith is accepting and we don't have any rules which say I'm forbidden or I'm not allowed to love somebody of the same sex, there equally isn't necessarily a welcoming and receptive. It's not necessarily the most visibly welcoming place, I would say, for somebody from a minority ethnic, from a sexual orientation that comes from a sort of minority background. That it doesn't exist. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in terms of making the Sikh faith places more inclusive to all people, whether it be to sexual orientation or whether it be for gender identity. There's a lot of work to do in that space. So working with Sarbat, I'm really glad, and others that are here as well today, people like Jayne and Matt, who, we work with these organisations as well, who are on this journey together. We look at things through an interfaith lens and try and make sure that we can learn from one another, try and support one another in terms of community allyship as well. And I think we're slowly moving to a space where we can start having more of these conversations. It's quite interesting, because when I say, I don't think the faith is inclusive, well, faith places aren't inclusive. They say, well, how do you want it to be more inclusive? Everybody's welcome. I say, yeah, but you're not explicitly making that clear. And also the key messages are for young people. Young people don't know it's okay to be Sikh and to be LGBT+, because there is nothing visibly that gives those messages. And when you sort of start being very explicit about those sorts of things, then that becomes out much more clearly, I think, to the people that we're talking about. So so I don't know how am I doing for my time, Alice, but essentially that's a whistle-stop tour. I could go on forever.
It's fantastic. You've got 1 minute left if there's more you want to say.
No, so I think I've wrapped it up, and if there's any more, I can cover that in the Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you ever so much. That's a great opening. We'll come on to Rosalind in a second. What I would say, if members of the audience do want to start asking questions, we're not going to answer them until everyone on the panel has had their slot. But if you did want to ask a question, hopefully you can see at the bottom of the Zoom screen a Q&A box. So if you click on that, or you can use the chat, and I'll keep a track, and then I'll facilitate it at the end. So over to our second speaker, Rosalind.
Thank you. So I'm so grateful to be invited to come here today, and I've a little bit of what are they calling imposter syndrome here on this eminent panel. But I think that an invitation was extended out to Not Alone Plymouth, which is a trans and non-binary support group in Plymouth, and I am as far as I'm aware, first ever cis-identifying person on the panel there, on the committee there. So I'm here. I can't say I'm representing Not Alone Plymouth, but I just wanted to give them a shout out and just share my story. So I grew up in the 90s in rural and small town, kind of Midwest America. It's every story from every Christian queer podcast you've ever heard is to say, these are the issues. My family identified really strongly with the church. My parents and grandparents. That's really I can't explain strongly enough how much being part of the church is part of me and part of how I was growing up. For example, I sort of went through Sunday school, graduated Sunday school, as you do, started teaching Sunday school in my early teens. There's absolutely, until lockdown, there's not a single period in my life that I haven't regularly attended church on Sunday. And it hasn't always been the same types of churches, but I always found that's an important part of my just somewhere to be grounded and something to go and have that kind of time to worship. And in fact, I'm interested in lots of different types of Christian worship and denominations. Although I've mostly been a member of the same denomination, I've always found it interesting, even before starting to scan how different denominations view LGBT issues. I was sort of interested in how different denominations view different issues around biblical interpretation and various teachings. So in terms of where my queer identity came in, I didn't know or wasn't aware. I'm not quite sure how to explain that. I didn't know I was attracted to people of more than one gender until after university. I moved to the UK and I met someone. I didn't really come out then either. I didn't identify with a particular label. Just the first time my parents visited me in the UK, she introduced them to the woman I was dating. I don't know what I thought was going to happen, but it did not go well. So I mean, that sort of started about 5 years period when I look back, and I just didn't come out anymore really. I didn't speak to anyone at church about it. I didn't say anything really about my relationship status, or if I did somehow mention that to a partner, I absolutely wouldn't mention any pronouns or gender of my partner. When I visited the States, or at that time we visited the States together, and it was just my roommate, you know, someone I was traveling with. So I'm not really sure how I reconciled all this for so long, except I just wasn't fully out in any aspect of my life. So not being out at church was just another place I wasn't fully out. I mean, individuals knew. Individuals, for the most part, were respectful, but for the most part, also there's a sort of, I kind of liken it to kind of the don't ask, don't tell thing that they have in the military in the US. It's sort of, well, okay, well, I'm going to keep that to myself now you've told me. It's like, well, okay, I'm glad you are not going to, you know, go telling things about me without my permission. But there was just an assumption that's the sort of thing you keep to yourself. So I attended various like parish churches, Church of England, London, Plymouth, one in Cornwall for a while. But at one point I realized there was a church in Plymouth, which is the same denomination, which is the same as where I grew up in the States. And when I went there, visited there, they even had the same hymnal that I grew up with. It really felt like home. So instead of going to various churches, I wasn't, you know, fully participating. I joined that church, and I really did start to participate and took on various roles and volunteered there, and, you know, really became part of that sort of church family. So I had a little bit of a struggle at that time. I didn't want to be dishonest to the leadership, and so I decided. I spoke to the church leader, and I said, well, I, you know, just want to let you know I'm cohabitating with my partner. My partner's female. I mean, both of those issues are just like, you know, things I wouldn't be able to probably say to my parents when I was in my 20s. Like, it's not acceptable things to say. But I said it went relatively well. They didn't immediately ask me to leave. At that time, I took that as a good result. But clearly they said, you know, but I think, you know, that's not what we teach, and it's probably best if you keep that to yourself. So even coming on here or preparing to come here today, I had in the back of my mind that somehow by being out and queer and Christian, I'm going to somehow get my church into trouble. I don't know if that's a valid fear, or if that's something that just like some baggage I have around kind of the attitudes in the churches that I've been part of. So then, you know, for a very long time after that, I was part of the church. I was on and off part of the sort of LGBT community in Plymouth. But being in the church is sort of okay as long as I'm not my full self. And it's all right to be sort of Christian in an LGBT circle so long as you don't kind of talk about it too much. So I think you easily sort of trigger people's bad experiences or kind of some hostility. And I guess that's born of their bad experiences. But I feel like sort of divided in where I could be, which part of me I could be, depending on who I was mixing with. But I guess if that was the whole story, I probably wouldn't be on the panel. Just about 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, my sibling came out as trans, and they were an active participant in church in the States, the same church where I grew up in, you know, in the praise band. They're teaching Sunday school, and they decided to leave the church, you know, rather than come out or begin transitioning there, because it was almost certain, I mean, to be fair, it's almost certain they would be asked to step down from those roles, any leadership roles at minimum, you know, if not having to leave. And it really struck me at that time that you know, my sibling didn't have the option to stay and keep quiet as I'd done. And at that point, it sort of was like a wake-up call to me, like, I need to look for an affirming church, not just affirming for me, but affirming for my siblings and my friends in the kind of LGBT community. So I got involved in Not Alone Plymouth, fantastic support group, fantastically welcoming, learned a lot, still learning a lot. But then I started to realize I was sort of ashamed to tell people which church I went to. I couldn't tell the people at you know, at the group that there was an affirming and welcoming church in Plymouth, you know, who would affirm their identity. I mean, there's no church in Plymouth listed on the Inclusive Church website. I think there's one in Ivy Bridge, and I think that's possibly closest. Tavistock as well, I think, maybe. Yeah, it just really frustrated the city this size with no inclusive churches, or no advertising as inclusive. I looked, I spent a long time during lockdown looking at church websites, you know, scanning for any rainbow flags, any indication that that would be an okay place to go. I need to find a church where I can sort of proudly say that my trans siblings would be welcome, and I can just bring my whole self, and maybe, you know, if I met someone again in the future, bring a partner regardless of their gender. In my ideal world, that would be a sort of church that fully supports marriage equality and also subscribes to traditional creeds. I'm somewhat traditional. I'm kind of nervous I'm not liberal enough for some of the affirming churches that are out there. So when I say there's no church, I guess I mean there's no Trinitarian church, because of course, you know, there's a Quaker Meeting House and there's a Unitarian church. So I kind of get myself stuck between finding something that sort of matches my identity in terms of my Christian beliefs as well. So I believe in substitutionary atonement, which is very, very old-fashioned. I wasn't speaking about an issue related to that affirming church in Tavistock, and just out of the blue said, well, that's quite barbaric teaching. It's like, oh, okay, right. So I'm supposed to be careful what I say about my Christianity, and to be careful, you know, when I'm with conservative Christians, what I say about my queer identity, if anything. So I'm set on joining an affirming denomination as soon as I find the right one. I just don't feel I can wait for kind of evangelical churches to catch up in that regard. I absolutely respect people who will stay in sort of more conservative churches for their own reasons, or, you know, I'm really grateful for those people who are working for change. But what it comes down to really, just for me to finish on, is I used to think sort of being queer compromised my ability to witness to God's love to other people, that sort of somehow compromised my Christian witness. But now I realize, and it's much more overwhelmingly the feeling that being in a church that sort of didn't tell me that that wasn't the case, it didn't tell me that it was okay to be queer and Christian, it is really compromising my witness to other LGBT people, and I don't want to, and I reconcile the issues within myself, but I want to reconcile in my life and in the groups I participate in, so I can say to people like, yeah, it's fine, you can come along to church with me, won't be an issue, you know. I look forward to that day.
Thank you ever so much. I feel like by the end we're all going to be sort of stunned into, you know, hearing your stories, and I really, you know, value and appreciate everyone's honesty and being here today, so thank you for sharing that. Okay, next we're going to Osman from Hidayah.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, I can.
Great, thank you. I'll just start now. Firstly, I'd like to thank everybody for allowing me to take part in this event today. So my name is Osman, and I volunteer for an organisation called Hidayah. Sadly, for many LGBTQI+ Muslims like myself who are not out to their family and friends, life can seem very isolating. However, it's always important to remember you're not alone. Reaching out to organisations like Hidayah can provide that important support. So here at Hidayah, our vision is to ensure that the voices of LGBTQI+ Muslims are heard and understood, and our mission is to provide support and welfare for queer Muslims and promote social justice and education around queer Muslim community to counter discrimination, prejudice and injustice. I think to start with, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about my own personal journey. So I grew up in a predominantly Black and brown Muslim community, and I really didn't feel comfortable being out. My parents are migrants who grew up in a very different time, in a different place with very different values from my own. One of 6 siblings, both my mum and dad work 7 days a week. If we needed any support, we could always rely on our local community to help out. However, growing up with 4 brothers, I was around a lot of toxic masculinity. For cultural and religious reasons, I was always afraid to be my true self. Worried that people would figure out my sexuality, I put on a very macho front. And it was only when I was 16 that I got the opportunity to visit family in London. My uncle had set up a new business, and I decided that I would help out and stay there. I had heard that there was a gay community in London and decided that I would be better off staying in London, and maybe I would meet someone and live my life on my terms without my family finding out. However, instead of finding acceptance, I was met with racial abuse and told to leave the first gay bar that I had frequented. This rejection made me really angry at the gay community, and to be honest, this was like a turning point in my life. I got involved with a lot of crime and a lot of trouble with gangs. I hated myself and wanted to push my family and friends away. I struggled with relationships and went on to try and conform to society and married my now ex-wife. After 2 years of marriage, we split up and I fell into a depression. And at this point, my family intervened. I ended up going to a holy pilgrimage with my mum to Mecca. And it's while I was in Mecca that I finally accepted my sexuality. I made positive changes in my life and joined Hidayah, which at that point was just a Facebook page of a few people. I was lucky enough to meet people that had similar lived experiences as me. And then I decided to use this organisation to help other young people that were struggling with their identity and their faith. I now volunteer and help stop young people going down the same self-harm and self-destructive route that I went down. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the struggles faced by and some of the challenges faced by queer Muslims. So for many of us, there is this lack of religious support. Many Muslims don't feel comfortable talking about sexuality with faith leaders, and faith leaders are not open to discussing LGBT issues for the fear of losing their congregations. In terms of community support, it's not safe to be out in the community. This concept of family honour and bringing shame to the family scares queer Muslims from coming out. On a personal level, I really don't care what people think about me, but I do worry about how my sexuality could be used against my family and also the community ostracizing them because of me. Now, lack of family support. There is no lack of family support. Unfortunately, for families like my own, being gay is seen as a Western phenomenon. It's a lifestyle choice. That's how my family would see it. So for us, Hidayah has become this adoptive family. This family that loves us unconditionally and provides us with that support and a safe place to be our true selves. I think that's really important. So what challenges do we face? Racism and Islamophobia in the queer community, homophobia in the Muslim community, and queer Muslims feel like we're stuck in the middle of all of this. So talking about racism and Islamophobia in the queer community, it can be difficult for Muslim LGBTQI people to find accessible and safe places within the queer community. Queer Muslims face damaging stereotypes from other members of the queer community. When some of our members have attended queer venues, they've come across barriers as people presume that just because they're wearing a headscarf or a hijab, that they're in the wrong place. And then when you add alcohol to the mix, you find yourself defending your faith and trying to convince people that you can be gay and Muslim. These constant microaggressions is enough to turn anyone away. In 2019, Manchester Pride revealed its move to start using a different flag, one that includes black and brown stripes. And this was to ensure people from Black, Asian and other ethnic minority backgrounds felt represented and welcomed at their events. But this change had a mixed reaction. A fierce debate raged between people who believed the move is inclusive and those who felt it was unnecessary. However, my opinion is, and my argument is, that how can a gay white man have the same experiences, lived experiences as I do? And now talking about politics, not my favourite subject, the political climate has changed and we see more and more LGBTQI plus people supporting conservative right-wing views. Recently, some gay Trump supporters cited Islam and immigration being their main concerns in America. And even closer to home, governments in countries in Europe are also weaponizing sexuality against Islam and immigration. I wanted to finish by giving examples of some visible queer people that I came across. During lockdown, many of us have had to go online. And when I mention TikTok, the first thing that people might think of is people posting dance routines and doing silly viral challenges. But for many queer Muslims across the world, TikTok became the social media platform to raise awareness of being queer and Muslim and tell the rest of the world that their identity is valid. Now, please bear with me. I am going to try and play these. They might not work, but let's give it a try.
Hi, I'm Bisma and I'm queer Muslim and my identity is valid.
Hey, my name is Dia and I'm a queer Muslim TikToker. I just want to let you guys know that no matter what happens, you're going to be always valid and loved. With that being said, don't listen to these straight cis bigots. Thank you.
Hey, I'm a queer Palestinian Muslim and I'm very valid.
Hi, I'm Raya and I'm a queer Muslim. And to all the other queer Muslims out there, I want you to know that we are here, we are together, we have each other, we are a community, and nobody can tell us that we are invalid or invisible.
Hey, I'm Michaela, and I wanted to let you know that if you're queer and Muslim, we see you, we love you, and we support you in your identity.
Okay, so I'm with my mom right now. Okay, how'd you feel when I came out to you? I came out to her when I was 13. I'm 18 now. Okay, Mama, how did you feel?
How did I feel?
Yeah, when I came out to you.
I love you. I can't live without you.
Okay.
And I accept you.
Thank you.
And I kind of sensed something when you were a child.
Yeah, we all knew. It wasn't a surprise.
I love you.
I love you too.
You are not a mistake. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not make mistakes. Science is broad. We are still as humans learning. No one wants to be abnormal and be ostracized by society. So you are a special, beautiful child, a beautiful human being. I love you.
What do you have to say to people who are being rude right now in the comments?
I think they're ignorant and they need to be educated.
Hell yeah.
And I think they need to look into more research.
I know I'm kind of short of time, but I'm just going to quickly rattle on. I just wanted to mention that thanks to these visible people, we now see more queer Muslims challenging views of heteronormative attitudes in Muslim society today, stating scripture and hadiths, giving positive examples of queer identities and interpretations of Islam. And this is so important, especially now. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you ever so much. I was so engrossed. I didn't look at who was next. Apologies. That was really, really wonderful talk. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so next we go to Ben Freeman.
Hi everyone. My name is Ben, and I'll be talking about being LGBTQ+ and Jewish. And I actually think that, and when Andy asked me to take part, I said to him, "Have you made a mistake? Are you sure you want me to come?" Because Jewish identity is very complex, actually. And this week, on Monday, I published my first book, which is called Jewish Pride. You can see them just above me. Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. Because that is something that is very misunderstood about Jewish identity, that we're actually not just a religious group. We are an ethnic minority. We are a people, a nation, a civilization. So that makes it quite complicated for people to understand us. So when he asked me to take part and represent Judaism, I said, while I'm Jewish, I talk about my Jewishness rather than my Judaism. But saying that, and that is something I really want everyone to take away from this conversation, is kind of a wider understanding of Jewish identity from that perspective, because though I'm very actively Jewish, I wear a yarmulke, a head covering every day. I wrote a book about Jewish pride. I'm actually not really very religious. I'm not even sure I believe in God. I'm not even sure I really ever think about it, to be honest. But obviously, saying that, there is a religious aspect to our identity. It's just not necessarily the one that I relate to. But I wanted to talk about how my LGBTQ plus identity has influenced how I feel about my Jewishness. And many people will think, okay, well, there's tension there, right? You know, a lot of us have spoken about the tension between religious groups, or in my case, perceived religious groups, and being LGBTQ plus. But in many ways, and there is absolutely tension, and I will discuss that, but in many ways, actually, I've been able to fuse these two identities, and the way I've been able to fuse them is through the concept of pride. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story regarding both LGBTQ plus and Jewish pride. I, like many LGBTQ plus people, especially I think, Pritpal, you mentioned growing up in the 90s. I did it also. Section 28 was in law for the first decade of my life. And the society I grew up in was deeply homophobic. Not my family, not my friends, but the world around me. I remember seeing the adverts warning people against AIDS in the early 90s that just featured enormous tombstones. And I felt so deeply ashamed. And I really hated myself. And this, I've got to say, was not in connection to my Jewishness. In many ways, they were totally separate at that point. But I found myself saying that if I was not, I basically just couldn't come to terms with myself for a very long time. And then I realized that I actually had no choice. I had to accept myself. I didn't want to end my life. I didn't want to live in the same kind of depressed state that I had existed in for a very long time. And I began the very long road to pride. And it's really interesting because when you tell people about your coming out story, people, especially heterosexuals, assume, oh, and then you were fine. Like, I told everyone, and then tick box, it's great. And actually, for many people, and especially for me, that was the beginning of my journey. And I had to do real active work that I think all of us have to do to become comfortable with our identities. But I had a very interesting experience at university, and this is where my two identities didn't necessarily fuse, but they were kind of brought in opposition to one another. I was a Jewish student at the University of Glasgow, and I experienced unbelievable anti-Semitism. I've done work with the University of Plymouth on this issue specifically, and I have to say that universities now are no longer safe, and were not then. I say no longer in terms of America, but in the UK, are not safe spaces for Jewish students, really. And it was true then, and I was abused. And I'm going to say racially abused, because anti-Semitism is a form of racism. I was racially abused by my professors, by my peers. There was a culture of demonizing Jewish people. But fascinatingly enough, that was also the time that I came out. And the same people who were calling me a racist, a colonizer, a white supremacist, just because I was a Zionist Jew, were embracing me for being gay. And this has been an experience I've had my entire life, unfortunately. And for, to cut a long story short, I realized at one point there was a need for pride in the Jewish community. We commemorate our dead, we memorialize those of our loved ones who died, who were murdered rather, in the Holocaust, but we don't talk about the shame, we don't talk about the trauma that I think we as an LGBTQ plus community are much better at talking about. And I'm really proud that I was able to write a book about the Jewish people, inspired specifically from my LGBTQ plus identity. And in many ways, the book is many things, but it's in part memoir. And I discuss issues such as internalized anti-Semitism through the lens of my experience with internalized homophobia. Kind of referring to what Osman said about prejudice within the LGBTQ plus community. I have to say, and I've got to say, I was even nervous to come and do this because LGBTQ plus spaces are, similarly as I said about academia, are not generally safe spaces for LGBTQ plus Jews. I do not really feel safe in them. They're not spaces I will go into really anymore. For example, at the Dyke March in the US,
Thank you so much, Ben. Okay, now we are heading over to, again, I was engrossed not looking at the list. We've got Jayne next.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you all for being with us today. It's a real privilege and a pleasure being alongside such a great panel. I'm Jayne Ozanne. I grew up in an evangelical Christian home, and I've been on quite a journey, which I'll try and summarize in a second. But I now work with religious leaders across the faith groups and indeed internationally. And I hope my story will help inspire people to think about how what can be, for many of us, a really tough journey can be used to be turned around, if you like, to have authenticity and to enable us to speak with insight and indeed, I think, some authority to people who can help us change the world. I must admit, I used to really cringe at the word pride. Being a good old Christian, I used to think that one of the great sins was being pride, and we needed to be humble, and I wanted to distance myself from anything called LGBT pride. But as I've reflected over the last 6 years, I realized that it is the absolute antidote to what I spent most of my life living under, which was a deep feeling of shame. I didn't know that I was gay. I didn't know that women could be gay. I think I'm a bit older than some of the panelists. I might be giving away my age a bit, but I grew up in Guernsey in the Channel Islands, and frankly surrounded by cisgendered, white, straight, married couples, or so they seemed. And I had no idea that women could be attracted to women. I had no role models. It was not something I'd even come across. And so it wasn't until my mid-20s, when I was living in Paris and working alongside a woman who I was utterly devoted to. We spent all our working time together and all our evenings and weekends together, all just good friends. But it took her best friend the courage to take me out to dinner one day and put the question to me directly: Jayne, when are you going to admit to yourself and everyone else that you're madly in love with my friend? And I was really horrified. How could that be? But I knew in her naming it, she touched on something very deep, and something that I hadn't wanted to look at myself. That I, who desperately wanted to love and be loved, was finding myself attracted to the one thing that I thought was an abomination and that God couldn't bless, i.e., a same-sex relationship. And that internalized shame, that internalized horror, kept me a prisoner. I didn't want to talk to anyone about it. So we didn't really have the internet back then. And I truly thought I was the only person in the world going through the hell that I was going through. And it was that isolation, that loneliness, that led me to a very dark place where my body started to really crack under the stress. And sadly, I found myself in hospital going through a whole load of tests for significant pain. And it took a very brave consultant to challenge me and say, Jayne, we just think you're very, very stressed. Is there something that you're not admitting to yourself or anyone else? And looking back, I now realize that he probably knew better than I did what I was facing. Shortly after that, I had a full-blown breakdown, sadly. This was back in the 90s. And part of that was because I didn't want to mention to anybody in my faith community that I was struggling with this, because I knew the moment I named it, I would be put on what I call the theological naughty step, the step from which there was no return. Even if I was just questioning who I was, I didn't feel I could have that conversation safely. And so I went through a very dark time and eventually started to put myself through conversion therapy. I had about 15 years of that. I talk about conversion therapy being almost in 3 stages. The first being the private stage, which I've just touched on, which has a lot of internalized shame. The second, when you start to reach out to people and ask, in my case, for prayer. People who love you, who want you to be whole, who want to see you healed because they believe, their faith leads us to believe that God would intervene and change me. And that led to a different type of shame, because it meant that I was having to share very intimate things that had happened to me, perhaps relationships that had gone wrong, or relationships with my parents that frankly I shouldn't have been sharing with people who weren't trained. And what was more difficult was, as much as people prayed and earnestly believed that God would intervene, I knew it wasn't working. And so I was told that I didn't have enough faith, that maybe I wasn't being open and honest enough. And that took me to the third phase of conversion therapy, where I sought much more drastic interventions, if you like. I sought deliverance ministry, and I was quite a senior evangelical in the church. I was on something called the Archbishop's Council, and that put me in a place where I was traveling the world and speaking as a senior female evangelical. So in a position where I could ask many people to pray with me. And many of them thought that they had a word from God who could deliver me of a spirit of homosexuality or whatever it was. Now, after I came off council, I took myself off on retreat, wondering what God would do with me next. And for a long story, it's all in my book, Just Love, but I found myself in Oxford doing a course for diplomats. I've done a lot of work in international relations and religion, and I felt it was important that the university world started looking at the intersection of religion and international relations. So I was at Oxford, and on my course, I met an extraordinary woman who was going to become a very dear friend of mine, just a friend, but I found myself falling, as always, just for her, and realizing that all those years of prayer, all those years of conversion therapy hadn't worked. And that instigated, sadly, a second spell in hospital and a second breakdown. And at that point, I felt I had no option but to come out to myself. I wanted to see if what I yearned for, which was the love of a woman, would actually bring me the happiness and joy that I so desperately wanted. Unfortunately for me, I did meet an extraordinary woman who I was with for many years, and my life just burst into technicolor. And you know, that's the most important witness in all of this. When we find love, even the most ardent conservatives can't help often seeing the transformation in us. They still may not agree theologically, but they can see the fruit. But at that time, I truly believed that God was not approving of my relationship. And it took me some years still to realize that I could square that terrible circle of being Christian and gay. And now I, with some pride, I suppose, campaign on the basis of being unashamedly Christian and unashamedly gay. And I'm very involved with the Church of England, where I'm back involved in its politics, trying to lead a debate on sexuality and the church. Back in 2017, we had a very important debate where we voted to ban conversion therapy. And I was then appointed to the government's LGBT advisory panel, because one of the things that I noticed with the LGBT community at large is that we don't, for very obvious reasons, find it easy to talk about faith. And often there are, in my world at least, three comings out. The first is coming out as gay to your Christian friends, which sadly means you often lose many of them, as I did. I lost many friends and family and work prospects. And you form a new community of LGBT friends. But when you come out as Christian, you can sadly lose a lot of them too. And within your smaller bubble of LGBT Christian friends, if you come out as an evangelical, well, you might as well go to the moon on your own. It's a very small world, and it's that we need to change. And that's why events like this are so important. I'm very fortunate that I've spoken down in Plymouth. I know Ellie Spicer is on this call, and she's already put in the chat that there's a great church if you are a Christian or if you're wanting to explore at Mutley Baptist Church. I think it's Baptist, but Mutley Church, where very affirming, very accepting, and that change is happening. And my foundation, which various senior church figures came together to help me found just after that debate on conversion therapy, where we sought to work with religious leaders around the world in order to try and tackle discrimination and prejudice. And the first thing we did, and I'm wondering if I can share screen, I'm hoping I can, if that's okay. The first thing we did was to set up an Interfaith advisory board, which people might be pleased to know about. So I'm just going to, if I'm allowed, share the screen. Can you share that? See that? People nod, hopefully. So we've got quite senior members here in the UK. Jagbir Jyoti Jahal is an academic and Sikh and studies at Birmingham University. Anil Barnot on the Hindu Council. Dilwar Hussain, a fantastic Muslim advocate and speaker, who has new horizons in British Islam. Rabbi Laura, who was the senior rabbi to Reform Judaism, is on our board. Frederick Hyde Chambers, who's the president of the Dharma Centre, a big Buddhist centre in the UK. Ursula, I should have mentioned, many may know, is a very well-known Catholic in Ireland, who when she came out just before the referendum, literally swung the vote towards marriage because she was so well respected. Hannah Brock-Womack is a Quaker who was forbidden from taking up her place on the Churches Together in England Council because she's married to her wife, but she represents the Quakers. And David Main is the chair of the Baptist Union Council, and Michaela Youngson is the former presidents of the Methodist Conference. So a great group of people wanting to work together and amplifying their voices. And last December, we took that a step further. And if you're, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but if I'm allowed one more minute, I'm going to share a video that was put together of a declaration which you may or may not have heard about, which we put together called the Global Interfaith Commission on LGBT Lives. And we invited senior religious leaders from around the world to sign. The first person who signed up was Desmond Tutu, which was wonderful. And now we have over 10 archbishops and 60 bishops and many senior rabbis and Sikh leaders and Muslim leaders. There's still a long way to go, but the important thing is to try and unite those who want to speak out to end discrimination and violence and to end conversion therapy, and to challenge this sort of LGBT versus faith narrative to LGBT celebrated by faith. So if this is going to work, it may take me just a second to set up. I'd love to show you the video of the declaration made here in the UK. It was made during lockdown, so we could only have UK. Let's see if it works.
We come together as senior religious leaders, academics and lay leaders from around the world to affirm the sanctity of life and the dignity of all.
We affirm that all human beings of all sexual orientations, gender expressions, and gender identities are a precious part of creation and are part of the natural order.
We affirm that we are all equal under God, whom many call the divine, and that we are all therefore equal to one another. We call for all to be treated equally under the law.
We recognize with sadness that certain religious teachings have often, throughout the ages, caused and continue to cause deep pain and offense to those who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex.
We acknowledge with profound regret that some of our teachings have created and continue to create oppressive systems that fuel intolerance, perpetuate injustice, and result in violence. This has led and continues to lead to the rejection and alienation of many by their families, their religious groups, and their cultural communities.
We ask for forgiveness from those whose lives have been damaged and destroyed on the pretext of religious teaching.
We believe that love and compassion should be the basis of faith and that hatred can have no place in religion.
We call on all nations to put an end to criminalization on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, for violence against LGBT individuals to be condemned, and for justice to be done on their behalf.
We call for all attempts to change, suppress or erase a person's sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression, commonly known as conversion therapy, to end, and for these harmful practices to be banned.
Finally, we call for an end to the perpetuation of prejudice and stigma, and commit to work together to celebrate inclusivity and the extraordinary gift of our diversity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jayne. That's wonderful. Okay, and our final speaker on the panel is Matt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great, thank you. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Matt Mahmood-Ogsten, and I'm from an organisation called the Naz and Matt Foundation. We are a registered charity established in 2014. Trigger warning, some of the subject matter I'm about to discuss may be triggering to you. Naz and Matt Foundation's work is to remove the barriers that prevent religious and culturally conservative parents from accepting their lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or intersex children. Our charity started as a result of my beautiful fiance of 13 years, Naz, Dr. Nazim Mahmood, sadly taking his own life just 2 days after his deeply religious parents confronted him about being gay for the first time. They had told him to see a psychiatrist to find a cure for being gay because they'd heard it on radio programs. They treated Naz like a disease, like the very part of him that he was proud of the most, his identity, needed to be got rid of. Less than 24 hours after Naz passed away, I had to speak to one of his parents on the phone for the first time in over 10 years. As I listened to what she had to say to me, she then uttered the following words. You do know that Naz was living in sin because of his religion, and you are living in sin because of yours. They told me not to tell anyone that Naz had liked men, as it would bring shame upon their family. Out of respect, I followed their wishes until it reached a point and I decided I could not sit back and let this happen to anyone else ever again. I continue to share our story as it often mirrors the experiences of the hundreds of people who have now come forward to our charity to request support. Since our charity started, we have delivered talks all around the UK to schools, colleges, universities, public sector bodies, central government, and the national and international press about the dangers of religious homophobia and conversion therapy. Our new documentary called My God, I'm Queer is now available to stream on Channel 4. It's a film that explores Naz and my own journey and introduces the audience to an incredibly inspiring family of contributors who demonstrate that there can be a positive way forward for queer individuals born into conservative religious families. Naz and Matt Foundation are the publishers of a book for primary school children called Salim's Secret, which tells the story of a young boy born into a religious family and the difficult journey he has to go on to find acceptance from his parents and his friends. Later this year, we'll be releasing a new book for religious parents of LGBTQI+ children to help them understand that we are born the way that we are and there is no shame in that. Each year, on the 30th of July, the day my darling Naz sadly passed away, we hold an annual online event called Out and Proud Parents Day. On this day, we encourage proud parents of LGBTQI+ children to come out to their family, to come out to their community, and come out on social media to tell the world how proud they are of their LGBTQI+ children. We hope by doing this, this will encourage a new generation of role model parents who can inspire other parents who may be struggling along this journey of understanding. And before I finish, please may I leave with you one shocking statistic from some research that we commissioned last year. 70% of UK LGBTQ+ individuals from religious or culturally conservative families who are rejected when they come out experience suicidal thoughts, depression, or anxiety. In other words, up to 70% of those individuals may be feeling that the only way forward is to take their own life because of the attitudes and lack of acceptance from their parents and religious community. This is a reality that must change, and everyone listening today has the power to change this. Because I can't sit back and let this happen to anyone else. The question is, can you? Thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me today to talk.
Thank you ever so much. In Alice's absence, can I ask if anyone wants to raise any questions and whether anything there is on the chat or the Q&A that we can answer at this moment? So we only have one question on there, which is, imagine you are a new student attending university for the first time. What would you look for in a chaplaincy, pastoral and spiritual support centre? What advice would you give to university chaplains or spiritual leaders? So if any of the panel would like to answer any of that. Yeah, Jayne, would you like to?
Yeah, sorry. I think it's a really good question, and university chaplains and indeed all chaplains have a really key role. Interestingly, we were trying to bring many of the chaplains across the faith groups together last year, but we got a bit stymied by the lockdown, because in a sense the chaplains, as you know, are slightly freer to say what they think, because they have to work within well, in your case, the education system, in others in the public sector, where the Equality Act is really sacrosanct. And therefore, I think the first two messages that all chaplains need to give is that they are there for all, independent of what religion or what faith, and try and dispel some of this sad rhetoric that has built up, you know, that means people often think twice about sharing or going to them because they fear they're going to be judged. And so, as I think Rosalind and others, Ben was saying, that, and Pritpal and Matt, we have to be really proactive in dispelling any fear and reassuring people that everybody is welcome, but that without judgment, without, you know, and will be listened to and supported whatever they're going through. And the second thing, and it's a bit harder to do, is to recognize that sometimes religious teaching has really caused a bit of a problem and is often the root cause why somebody needs to see the chaplain in the first place. And if someone's able to do that, which I know takes courage, but actually means that people will trust you right from the get-go. So we're looking at working on something called the Nightingale Statement, where we're urging chaplains to sign up to that actually shows they're a safe place to be, because sadly students need to know that they can go without fear or judgment.
Thank you ever so much, Jayne. Sorry, Alice, I'll pass back to you now. You disappeared for a moment.
Sorry, it's great that Zoom makes things like this so much more accessible. We've got Ben from Hong Kong, but of course, as soon as your Wi-Fi crashes, you're booted out. So yeah, apologies. And I assume you've started answering the first question. Did anyone else want to come in on that? No. Okay. Oh yeah, go on.
I just wanted to take a different take on it, really, in terms of the impact on LGBTQ plus people when faith is unwelcoming. I am somebody of the visible faith identity, and have found that in LGBTQ plus spaces, I can find a lot of hostility from people. Quite often when we try and understand where that hostility comes from, it might tend to come from people's own faiths, having rejected them, having given them a difficult time. So actually the impact of it results in not just the impact on the individuals who then become quite resentful potentially as well, but it's also impact on creating hate for other people. So we need to be really mindful, because at the end of the day, religion is all about love. So it's important that places, chaplaincies are going to be places that people can in confidence go, be listened to, rather than sort of be judged for being who they are and being rejected, because there's enough rejection that people face from their families and potentially from their communities without places of love, such as faith, places of faith, to be doing the same thing as well.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to kind of echo what Pritpal was saying, that, you know, universities for some people is the first time that they've left their home. This is the first time they're getting to explore their own identity. As well as that, it's an opportunity for some people who've never been to another country before, and it'll be their first time being alone around people they don't know, a language they don't know. So sometimes faith becomes quite important to people, to find someone that they can associate with. And I think it's important for chaplains and people in universities in general to be very open-minded and not judgmental, and, you know, be able to provide advice, and if not provide advice, at least point people in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for more questions, so if anyone, here we go, a question in the chat. So how explicit do you feel that a church fellowship needs to be in saying it accepts members of the LGBTQ plus community? Who wants to go first? Jayne's nodding.
Can I comment on that?
Okay, yes.
In my opinion, for myself and for some others I've spoken to, you have to be absolutely over and above, explicit and advertising. because I think someone put in the chat a minute ago, which is very, very kind suggestion about Motley Baptist, and my association, and I do apologize for this, is Southern Baptist, American Baptist. So when I thought of this Baptist church on Motley Plain, no thought entered my head that they could potentially be affirming. And when I checked their website out, somebody mentioned to me, I was only about a month or so ago, couldn't see any notice that it says anything there. I can see their members of the Evangelical Foundation. I didn't think they were terribly affirming. So how would we know? You've got to kind of let us know. And I think for unfortunately, sometimes, like we've been talking about here, it's not always clear. Like, so you're still affirming, but does that include me? So as many flags as you can possibly include, just to be really clear.
So Alice, I popped in the chat there, Creating Sanctuary, which is a movement and a set of resources that's working particularly in the evangelical church now to really try and encourage people, as Rosalind has already shown, to be really clear about where they stand, whether they are affirming or not. It's really important for safeguarding rules for all the reasons we've heard, and Matt's horrific story, and Matt, my heart goes out to you. I think we needed a moment to pause, taking in the horror of what happened to your beloved, and indeed to many others. So I work quite closely with a church in Manchester where a young teenager took her life, and that church has been on a huge journey into inclusion, and in fact they've been behind the Creating Sanctuary project, where they're trying to urge church leaders to be clear. And the great I suppose one of the things there is that Lizzie Lowe's mum is now my treasurer, and she too is working. So there are resources, there are movements, there are all sorts of things you can sign up, and it will be the same, I'm sure, across the faith groups, that as long as you are clear from the get-go. And people ask me, what does that mean? And I'd suggest, well, you can put something on your website, you can fly a flag, you know, a little rainbow pin on your collar. There are all sorts of wonderful symbols that physically, visually say, or you can just say at the start of a service, very clearly, all are welcome here. And by that, I mean all. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. I think I agree with everything that everyone's just said. I think it really does need to be explicit. For example, my local church, they have every single day of the year, they have a rainbow flag flying. They also have a trans flag flying, and that's highly visible in the local community. And I think just having that small, I think it's a small gesture, but highly visible gesture. It means, or at least it can suggest that all are welcome into that church environment. I think it's really important that it is explicit, because it can't be, it shouldn't be something that's difficult to find out. It needs to be really straightforward, it needs to be really obvious, and it needs to be very accessible to anyone.
Thank you. And I think as you were talking, there are those approaches that churches can take to publicise it, which feels really important. But I don't know what your views are. It also feels to me important that there's the education piece that sits behind it, so that actually the members of that community are upholding those values as well, because the worst, the unsafe situation could be that, the flags are flying and there's all those positive promotional work that's happened, but then the experience of LGBT plus people in that environment might feel not to recognise and uphold those values as well. Okay, any other questions, or panelists, any questions for each other, or any other thoughts? I will give our attendees a couple of minutes just in case there are people typing. An open question. To what extent would you say the pressure of the pandemic has affected / worsened the situation in some people's behaviour? And if so, to what extent are leaders of religious groups seeking to address this? Jayne, you're nodding, is that?
I don't always want to be first, but I suppose this is my life's work. So sadly, we've seen, the statistics, I was just going, I'll find a link for you, at the LGBT Foundation have done various surveys that show the plight of LGBT people during the pandemic has got worse. And that's for many reasons, but particularly young LGBT people living in non-accepting households, which are normally faith households, the mental impact on them is significant, because there's no get out, there's no way that they connect with their, if you like, private friends where they can be themselves in a safe place, and so that mental health pressure has been worse. But perhaps more worryingly, and we don't have the data for this, but there are within certain parts of the communities rumours and fake news as to what's causing the pandemic and who's spreading it. And again, obviously, it is often the minority groups who become the scapegoat, be they LGBT or people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And I think religious leaders have, sadly, in certain really right-wing places, fueled some of that intolerance. So we've seen a sort of a blaming, a scapegoating of the other. At the same time, I'm pleased to say that those who really believe in inclusion across the faiths are working harder than ever to try and reach out to all and everyone. So we've seen, in many ways, in some forms of the campaigning world, a polarization. But within the Church of England, and some of you may know, we've launched a big thing called Living in Love and Faith that's landed in the middle of the pandemic. What seems to have happened is that the middle ground, and when you're trying to win an argument, it's always the middle ground you need to win over and own, if you like. The middle ground has significantly shifted to becoming far more accepting. In fact, they don't really understand why we need Living in Love and Faith, this big document that the Church of England's just produced, anymore, because it seems out of date. So I think the bigger, so there's a complex answer. You've seen the wings polarized, the middle ground solidify into being celebrating, and sadly the LGBT communities we know being really impacted, and the stats I'll pop in the chat for anybody who wants to see.
Thank you, Jayne. Anyone else? Any of our panelists? Pritpal?
So it's difficult to know the impact on people who we don't have contact with, but a positive thing we have seen, certainly in the work I do with Sarbat, is that having to go online has given us the opportunity now to connect with a lot more people. The Sikh faith is a very small faith. I mean, there's no more than sort of 25 million of us globally, so we're a minority anywhere we go. And if you're LGBT and Sikh, you're going to be absolutely, possibly the only person in the world in your mind. But we've had people contact us from places like Thailand who've said, God, I've never met an LGBT Sikh person. I thought I was the only one. So it's given us a huge opportunity to reach out to people around the world who can now connect both those, the faith and their sexual orientation or gender identity, and bring that together within a global community online. So that has been a positive thing. So in terms of the connections that we've been building and the community we've been building. So hopefully once we come out the other side of this, that will make us a stronger community going forward.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, to kind of go off what Jayne was saying, and also Jayne, just to say, I'm doing an event on Sunday with Rabbi Laura Janner-Klausner, so I will tell her that I met you. Unfortunately, COVID has not led to, but contributed to really an explosion in anti-Semitism. We're seeing really ancient, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years old conspiracy fantasies being resurrected with accusations that the Jews caused COVID. I know in America, Jewish students, again, speaking about campus, were physically attacked because they were accused of spreading COVID. So yeah, it's been a very difficult time for the Jewish community. And I think the online piece is really interesting because in many ways, it's an incredible opportunity it affords us. Obviously, we're coming together from, well, mostly the UK and / all around the world for this event, but also we're seeing the internet, social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok being used to really further spread anti-Semitism, I'm sure other forms of prejudice too. So it's, yeah, I mean, it has been very difficult, and COVID specifically for Jews has been hard because we've been accused of spreading it. And there's no real combating it with any rationale because it's obviously irrational, but it's kind of speaks to this very deeply embedded systemic anti-Jewish racism that exists. So it's, yeah, that's been very difficult, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Anyone else? Any other questions? Very cute kitten. Jane.
A very naughty one. Sorry, he's been walking over my keyboard and putting my camera off. So sorry.
It's fine. I don't think they know any other way, do they, kittens? Okay. We have got, just under 10 minutes if there are any questions. If not, then obviously we can finish slightly earlier. Yeah. Oh, is there someone?
I was going to ask a question.
Yes.
I wondered if everyone from the panel could suggest any podcasts or websites, whether it's your own or someone else's, that you find particularly helpful on this topic of LGBT and faith.
Great question. Who wants to start?
I will not mention a podcast, but I'm going to plug my book because I do think it's kind of fascinating and inspiring to see someone connected to a faith community, whether it's, that's my full identity or not, certainly connected to a full identity, faith identity, twinning their LGBTQ plus identity with that, and also using their LGBTQ plus identity to become more comfortable. And I think that identity, whether it's Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Black or whatever LGBTQ plus, we're all facing challenges. And I think that even though there is obviously specifics to each of our stories, being a minority is difficult. And I think that we can learn a lot from each other's experiences. So while this book certainly will help you learn about the Jewish experience and Jewish identity, it should also help you think about your own on a deeper level, I think.
Thanks, Ben. And your book is called?
It's called Jewish Pride Rebuilding a People, and it's available on Amazon and Book Depository.
Okay, thank you. Who had their hand up? Pritpal?
I'm going to do a plug for some of the projects I've done as well. So I'm, as well as being LGBTQ+, I'm also a dad as well to 2 girls. So I've done a podcast with another bunch of dads who are in a similar position, either gay or bisexual. It's called Rainbow Dads. So it's 7 episodes long. So please do have a look at it. It's lots of different people, whether they're from faith backgrounds, non-faith backgrounds, or different backgrounds here in the UK, who grew up and had children and then had to come out to them at some stage. So just go through our journeys and we talk about them together. We've also compiled a book called Gay Dad. So again, for any gay dads out there, or support for dads that happen to be either gay or bisexual, there's some support there. But also at Sarbat, we're currently working on podcasts, and we've got a YouTube channel, so we will have some more resources coming out this summer, certainly in terms of the podcast, but we do have resources on our YouTube channel too, so do follow and subscribe.
Matt?
Hi, yes, I'd like to recommend 2. I know Hidayah have some podcasts, so I would recommend listening to Hidayah's podcasts. And I'd also recommend listening to a podcast series called the You Don't Love Me podcast. It's not specifically about religion and LGBT particularly, but the gay married couple who actually run the podcast, Amir and Anamia, they're a fantastic couple, and they kind of explore their faith, their journey, their change from the faith that they were born into, and really just kind of exploring, enjoying the world to be themselves.
Thank you. Osman?
I just want to say thank you, Matt, for giving us a wee shout out there. Yes, so we've released podcasts in 2019. They're all about a 4-series podcast, about 40 minutes each, and it's basically Muslim people talking about personal stories and journeys. But I also want to plug Matt's documentary as well, because it was really powerful, and it was just nice as someone who is queer and Muslim to see visible people that are happy living their true lives. And I think that's really important generally in all faiths. So please check out that documentary as well, Matt. Well done.
Thank you. Jayne?
So I popped in the chat, and there are other great links from everybody in the chat. On my own webpage, janeozanne.com, there's a list of resources for Christians and particularly evangelicals struggling. But at the global interfaith.lgbt website, you'll find all the launch conference speeches, and one from most of the faith groups. And if you want a senior faith leader who's saying something affirming, which you can use either to spark a conversation or by means of hearing their theological basis, that's a really good place to go. They're all relatively short, 15 minutes max, TED style talks, which I hope would be of use for you.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay. Something in the queue. Great, thank you for sharing all these links. That's wonderful. Okay. Any final questions or points? I would just like to express on behalf of the university huge thanks to all of you for being here today and being on our panel, sharing your stories, and I think leaving a very good amount of inspiration, actually, for me personally, and I'm sure those that are here in attendance and those that are watching back. Thank you very much for everything that you're doing and for sharing that with us today. I can't see any more questions, so I think we can conclude the event now, but we can't do a round of applause or anything, but I know we're all really grateful and appreciative of your time, so thank you, and hugely positive feedback already in the comments and some of the Q&A chat that's come up. So yeah, massive thanks to everyone, and hope to see you again, and we'll be following your following you online and seeing what you're up to. So yeah, thank you very much. Okay,
thank you.
Well, take care.